stretching from the misty islands of the Aleutians to the icy peaks of the Brooks Range. Alaska's story is as vast and dramatic as its landscape. For thousands of years before the first Europeans appeared on its rugged coasts, indigenous peoples thrived in its forests, tundra, and fjords, forging sophisticated cultures that drew life from salmon runs, caribou herds, and the rich seas of the North Pacific. Russian explorers arrived in the 18th century, followed by the 1867 U.S. purchase that transformed the region into an American frontier. Gold rushes, World War II battles, and the discovery of North Slope oil all highlighted its strategic and economic value. Today, Alaska blends ancient native traditions with modern industry, standing as a unique crossroads of wilderness, resources, and enduring cultural heritage. Prehistoric and Indigenous Era. Alaska's earliest chapters begin in the last ice age, when nomadic peoples crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into North America. Archaeological evidence shows that Paleolithic hunters entered what is now Alaska roughly 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, moving along glacial meltwater corridors into unglaciated refugia. Over millennia, these migrants diversified into the rich mosaic of native cultures found at European contact. Coastal peoples like the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian, interior Athabascan groups, the Unangaks, Aleut, and the Inuit, Inupiat, and Yupik in the north and west. They fished and hunted across Alaska's varied environments, from salmon-rich rivers and rainforests to Arctic tundra, and traded with neighbors across the northwest coast and Pacific Rim. Many native beliefs honored the animals and land. For example, salmon bones were ritually returned to streams for renewal of the fish, and grand potlatch ceremonies displayed clan wealth in elaborate gift-giving feasts. By the time of first European contact, Alaska's indigenous nations had complex social systems, art, and technologies adapted to local conditions, kayaks, totem poles, fur clothing, etc., and saw the land as a communal trust rather than foreign property. Thus, a deep web of native traditions and perspectives shaped Alaska's earliest human story. Russian exploration and colonization. In the mid-17th century, Alaska entered the global stage when the Russian Empire sent expeditions from Siberia across the North Pacific. In 1741, Commander Vitus Bering and Officer Alexei Chirikov sighted and landed on southeast Alaska, formally claiming the coast for Russia. Wealthy Siberian fur merchants, Promyshleniki, soon followed, hunting the abundant sea otters for their luxurious pelts. Grigory Shelikov in 1784 founded the first permanent Russian settlement at Three Saints Bay, Kodiak Island, opening the Aleutian and Gulf of Alaska coasts to trade. In 1799, Tsar Paul I chartered the Russian-American Company, RAC, with exclusive trading rights, and Governor Alexander Baranov, hired by Shelikov, expanded settlements on Kodiak and built Fort Archangel, Sitka, by 1804. Missionaries of the Russian Orthodox Church also arrived, converting many native people and translating liturgy into indigenous languages. These encounters brought profound change and disaster to Alaska's native peoples. Some coastal peoples resisted and fought back. In 1802, Tlingit warriors destroyed the first Russian fort at Sitka, though peace was later negotiated, and a new settlement, New Archangel, modern Sitka, was founded in 1804. The Russians often forced local labor and took hostages. Diseases like smallpox and influenza spread rapidly among isolated native communities. In the first two generations of contact, roughly 80% of the Aleut population perished from Eurasian epidemics. By the mid-1800s, overhunting had almost exhausted the prized sea otter herds, and Russia struggled to defend or profitably administer its distant colony. In this context, Tsar Alexander II agreed in 1867 to sell Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. Thus ended over 80 years of Russian Alaska, leaving behind enduring cultural legacies, active Orthodox parishes, Russian surnames and place names, even as new chapters of history began to unfold. Transfer to the United States. On March 30, 1867, Secretary of State William H. Seward signed the treaty purchasing Alaska from Russia, and the U.S. Senate swiftly ratified it that spring. The United States paid $7.2 million, about 2 cents per acre, to acquire Russian America. The treaty took effect on October 18, 1867, when Russian officials formally transferred possession at Sitka. Many Americans initially mocked the deal as Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox, viewing Alaska as barren and remote. Nonetheless, proponents argued it would extend American trade in the Pacific. In practice, nearly all Russian settlers soon departed, and Alaska remained sparsely populated for decades. Under U.S. rule, the territory was briefly called the Department of Alaska, 1867 to 1884, and then the District of Alaska, 1884 to 1912. For years, the federal government assumed control, setting the stage for new economic activities, whaling, fur trade with Americans, and eventually gold prospecting, and continuing the complex interactions between settlers and the native inhabitants. Alaska as a U.S. territory, 1867 to 1959. In 1912, Congress reorganized Alaska's government. The Second Organic Act renamed it the Territory of Alaska and granted it an elected legislature and delegate to Congress. By that year, the population was still only a few dozen thousand, although boosted by prospectors from the Klondike Gold Rush of 1896 and local strikes, Nome in 1899, Fairbanks 1902. In 1916, Delegate James Wickersham even introduced Alaska's first statehood bill, though with little local support at the time. During the World War I era, Juneau remained the territorial capital, and federal agencies ran much of Alaska's affairs. Economically, early 20th century Alaska remained frontier-like. The 1920 Jones Act required all goods to pass through U.S. ports and be shipped on American vessels. As a result, Alaskan industries, mining, fishing, had to route trade through Seattle, inflating costs. The Great Depression struck Alaska hard. Prices for salmon, copper, and lumber plummeted, halving real wages and reducing the workforce. In response, New Deal programs settled struggling Midwestern farmers in the Matanuska Valley during 1935 to 1936, establishing farming communities in an experiment of agricultural resettlement. These projects brought roads and electrical power to new areas, slowly knitting the territory closer together. Socially and politically, the territorial legislature began modest reforms. In 1913, Alaska granted women the right to vote, one of the earliest American jurisdictions to do so, and passed labor laws like an 8-hour workday and mining regulations. It also took tentative steps on native policy. Some native villages received limited self-government, and in 1915, Alaska let Alaska Natives vote in territorial elections on the controversial condition of giving up tribal customs. Segregation, however, persisted until after World War II. In fact, Alaska, in 1945, became the first U.S. jurisdiction to outlaw racial segregation altogether when it passed an Equal Rights Act banning discrimination. World War II and the Cold War period. World War II abruptly brought global conflict to Alaska's doorstep. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 1941, fears of a Japanese invasion prompted U.S. military buildup. In April 1942, the U.S. Army began construction of the Alaska Highway through Canada to connect Alaska by land. That same year, authorities forcibly evacuated and interned over 200 Alaska residents of Japanese ancestry under wartime security orders. Most dramatically, in June 1942, Imperial Japanese forces occupied the western Aleutian Islands, Attu and Kiska, initiating the Aleutian Islands Campaign. This was the first and only time in World War II that American soil was held by an Axis power. Over months of harsh fighting through early 1943, some 34,000 U.S. troops and their allies fought to reclaim the islands and succeed in February-August 1943. Alaska's role as a stepping stone also deepened cooperation with the Soviet Union. In 1945, at Cold Bay on the Alaska Peninsula, the U.S. conducted Project Hula, training 12,000 Soviet sailors and transferring 149 naval vessels for use against Japan. As the Cold War dawned, Alaska's strategic importance only grew. The federal government built numerous air bases such as Elmendorf near Anchorage, Fort Richardson, and early warning radar stations across the Arctic. In particular, the joint U.S.-Canada Distant Early Warning Line established dozens of radar sites in far northern Alaska and Canada to detect Soviet bombers. Alaska thus became a front line in America's global standoff, its vast tundra hosting missiles, military exercises, and signals intelligence to watch the polar approaches. Path to statehood and early state years. After decades as a quiet territory, Alaska finally achieved statehood in the late 1950s. Alaskan leaders like Ernest Gruening, delegate to Congress, and Bob Bartlett, later U.S. Senator, championed the cause. In 1958, Congress approved the Alaska Statehood Act, introduced by Bartlett, and President Eisenhower signed it on July 7, 1958. On January 3, 1959, Alaska was formally admitted as the 49th state. Its first governor was Bill Egan, and its inaugural congressmen included Bartlett and Ralph Rivers. Statehood brought new federal funding and attention. For example, Alaska received one of the largest land grants ever, over 100 million acres for statehood and public schools, and the right to elect voting representatives. One major post-statehood issue was native land claims. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 settled over a century of disputes. A NCSA extinguished Aboriginal title in exchange for establishing 12 regional and more than 200 village corporations controlled by Alaska Natives. These corporations received titles to about 44 million acres of land, roughly 1/9 of the state, and $962.5 million in compensation. The law created new institutions for indigenous self-determination and injected capital into Native communities. Another landmark event of the era was the 1964 Good Friday earthquake, magnitude 9.2, centered near Anchorage, which killed over 100 people and devastated cities. That disaster highlighted Alaska's geologic volatility and drew national relief efforts. Modern Alaska: economy, politics, and cultural identity. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Alaska's economy and society transformed around oil and natural resources. The discovery of vast petroleum reserves at Prudhoe Bay in 1968 ushered in an oil boom. In 1977, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline was completed, carrying North Slope crude 800 miles to the port of Valdez. Oil and gas remain the backbone of Alaska's finances. The state levies no personal income or sales tax because petroleum royalties fund roughly half of its government budget. To ensure future generations benefit, the state established the Alaska Permanent Fund in 1976, a sovereign wealth fund that invests oil revenues. As of 2019, the fund was worth about $64 billion, and it pays an annual dividend to every Alaskan. The 2024 payment was $1,702 per person. Beyond oil, Alaska's other key industries include commercial fishing, salmon, crab, and other seafood, tourism, cruise ships, and national parks such as Denali and Glacier Bay, and mining. The state's small population is heavily concentrated in cities like Anchorage and Fairbanks, but nearly half of Alaskans identify as indigenous or part indigenous. Modern politics often balance resource development against conservation and tribal interests. Debates over drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and protecting salmon streams, such as the proposed Pebble Mine controversy, illustrate ongoing tensions. Alaska leans politically conservative in national elections, but local issues of subsistence hunting, wildlife management, and village funding can transcend party lines. Culturally, Alaska today is a blend of its native heritage, frontier history, and lingering Russian influences. Alaska recognizes 20-plus indigenous languages, and many communities celebrate potlatches, whaling festivals, and elder councils that honor their ancestral practices. The 1971 Native corporations also sponsor cultural programs and language preservation, for example, Eskimo, Athabascan, and Tlingit language classes. From the Russian era remain dozens of active Orthodox churches. Many communities still observe Orthodox Christmas on January 7th, and Russian-derived place names and surnames. Iconic Alaskan symbols, the Iditarod sled dog race, summer solstice gatherings, and outdoor subsistence lifestyles reflect a rugged identity rooted in the land and sea. Climate change today is rapidly reshaping that world, with melting glaciers and thawing permafrost impacting villages and ecosystems. Nevertheless, Alaskans take pride in their state's frontier spirit, the last frontier, its cultural diversity, and its unique place between North America and the Arctic. Alaska's journey from ancient homelands to modern statehood spans Ice Age migrations, Russian colonization, American expansion, and the transformative forces of war, resource wealth, and cultural revival. Its indigenous nations continue to sustain vibrant traditions while shaping the state's political and economic future. From the oil fields of the North Slope to the glaciers of the Inside Passage, Alaska remains a land where natural grandeur meets human resilience. As climate change and new global challenges emerge, the story of the last frontier is still unfolding, rooted in a past as vast and enduring as the landscape itself.